The worm fishing part of the striper season is undoubtedly my favorite part of the year. Probably because it's so much like my trout fishing past. The worms are little tiny things. You can cast them with almost any size fly rod. And the striper that comes up and eats that little worm could be almost any size. So it's like chasing gigantic fish on little trout flies almost, at least numbers 4 and 6, something in that range. My simplest one is a fly. I call it the striper worm, which is basically a bunny type fly. It has a rabbit strip as a tail, and we'll start with that one. It'll be one of probably 4 or 5 worm flies that I'll post over the course of time. I use a fine monofilament tying thread and just wrap it down the length of the hook shank until you're at a point where you're directly above the point of the hook and the back edge of the barb. And then you can just trim off your excess. Remember, I have a wastebasket on the floor. I'm not throwing things. The bunny fur, a rabbit strip that I use, is going to be about twice the length of the hook shank when finished, plus I give it a little bit because I'm going to trim some fuzz off of here. So 2 things are going to happen now. One, I'm going to cut it to length and then tease out the little bits of excess fur that were at the cut. And then, because it comes too wide for this application, the skin is too much and it doesn't move side to side as you retrieve the fly. But if you reduce the width of this to about half by just cutting carefully down the middle of the skin side, then a normal straight line retrieve will let the fly move much more readily without having to wiggle the fly rod around or anything like that, and behaves much more like the actual worm. So you can see that these are pretty thin. Now, to make life easy, a little bit of moisture, stroke back the back part of this. You also can see it takes a little bit of bunny fuzz out of there. And then I'm going to trim the fur off that little bit of extra that I left when I cut the skin down the center. So I have a piece that essentially is no fur, or just a little tiny bit. And after moistening one more time to make sure I've gotten all of the loose stuff out, which takes a few bits of time, I tie that down onto the top of the hook shank. And you can twist and adjust it any amount you need. But you want to lock that down nice and tightly, because that's all the action that you build into the fly. That's all the movement that makes it look like a little worm swimming around. And when using this kind of material, always a little bit of head cement right there where it's tied in. That serves 2 purposes. One, it helps glue that little rabbit strip in place, and 2, it provides a little place to lock in this very small micro chenille. This is a root beer color, so-called. And it has a little bit of flash to it. It's a product of Hairline Dubbin, and it's called Midge Cactus Chenille. Very thin. We're going to tie this in at the eye of the hook, and then wrap down over it all the way to where we tied the rabbit strip in, and then bring the tying thread back to within 1/8 of an inch of the eye. And then just simply wrap the hook shank with the chenille. Because we tied it in full length, it makes a smoother transition, and there's not a big bump in the body. You just cut away your excess, and then you take some very fine black chenille. This, by the way, I bought when I was 16 as a full skein, and it seems to have lasted reasonably well. Tying lots of black woolly buggers and all sorts of other things. I'm far from 16 at this point in my life, and I still have it, which tells you how much you get. And then I'm just going to make 3 or 4 turns, in case 4, with the black chenille. 2 or 3 turns to lock it in place long enough for me to cut away the extra. Form a nice neat little head. Tie it off. This is a subsurface fly, and when the worms first start, which is usually around 4 o'clock or so in the afternoon, although sometimes earlier, they tend to be deeper in the water column than they would be later on when you'll see them all over the surface. So you can start fishing this at early on before you see anything happening, but suspect worms are going to appear. Now you can make a black spot like that, which the natural worm has, and that waving around in the water seems to attract the fish's attention enough so that it's worth doing. Also, in some cases, the center part of the worm is very pinkish, and if you wish, although not necessary, you can take pink or purple and just put a little stripe in that part of the body, and that represents that color change in the middle of the bottom of the worm. Not necessary. I've hardly ever bothered to do it, but it does help at times. This particular fly you will have to tie yourself if you're interested in anything except a number 6. Rainey's does provide it to their dealers in a number 6 size, but that's the only one that they have. A little bit of head cement, and you're ready to throw this in the water and make long, maybe 1 to 1 foot down to maybe 6 inches strips of the fly line, with the fly down below the surface 6 or 7 inches, and the stripers will come up and swat it. In mid-afternoon, let it sink right to the bottom and drag it. And that will provide some kind of activity. You'll know that the stripers are about to happen when you go out one day, fish with streamers and catch fish, and the next day fish the same places where you know there are fish, and they won't eat any of your flies. They're looking for those.